All right, why don't we get started and people join as they come in. So welcome to the 26th Annual John Howard Burse Memorial Program, and thank you for joining us. My name is Adam Braver, and I come to you from a snowy Roger Williams University Library in Bristol, Rhode Island. Our university library has hosted the Burse program for over a quarter century, a program that was endowed by alumnus Robert Blaze in order of his mentor, John Howard Burse. The edict of the program has been to celebrate great works or writers of literature, those with lasting impact and influence. Our library hosts an exhibition, both in person and virtual, and in the chat there is a link to the virtual exhibition that is developed by our archivist Heidi Benedict with this year with the assistance of 3 student fellows, Abigail King, Abby Lebowitz, and Ignacio Burgos. And then all is capped off with a lecture or discussion, such as we are having today. We've had a lot of partners this year in our interrogation of Kafka, and we are especially grateful to the National Library of Israel for resources surrounding their Kafka holdings and for them being co-sponsors for this panel discussion on Franz Kafka. At this point, I'll note that from the National Library, we have the curator for the humanities, Stefan Litt, on the panel, who is joined by translator Ross Benjamin and novelist and essayist Steve Stern. In lieu of introductions, I'll start with the same question for each of them, which I suspect will offer a better sense of their backgrounds as well as their interest in this topic. And lastly, in terms of the program, I'll ask a series of questions of our panelists, but there also is space in the Q&A button area, the Q&A Zoom button area, where you can also post questions, which, provided time allows, we will get into throughout the program. So those are the rules. So I'm going to start off, I guess, Stefan, since I named you first. We'll start, and I'm hoping, and the same question will then be for Steve and Ross, if you could talk a little about your relationship to Kafka and his works, and perhaps what his influence has been on you, either as a person or professionally, and we'll go from there.
Yeah, right. Thank you for having me with you today, and it's really an honor to speak to you. And I always love these conventions where we are crossing just borders and continents even. So it's really exciting for me to talk to you from Israel, despite the picture in the background. So I'm not sitting in the Prague on the Karlsbridge, but I thought it would be nice to have this as a background for tonight. So yeah, my relationship with Kafka actually began 15 years ago when I was still sitting in the National Library of Israel as a reader. And I heard about this outrageous law case that began in Israel about the ownership of Max Both's written estate, including Kafka items, Kafka manuscripts, and of course, the expectations about the questions. Maybe we will be able to find some recently or totally unpublished Kafka manuscripts and so on and so forth. So I saw that in the newspaper and the press, and I heard reports about it and so on and so forth. And at the same time, I applied for a position of the archivist being responsible in the National Library of Israel for the German-speaking language holdings. And I got the position. So, and pretty soon it was clear to me that maybe I got it because there were expectations to get this Max Brod estate. And then back in those days, unfortunately, the relationship between the National Library of Israel and the German Literature Archive in Marbach, who was hoping to get these materials as well, were not the best. And Marbach then claimed that the colleagues in Israel do not have the abilities and the understanding and the language skills in order to treat such materials and to arrange it in a proper way. And my guess is because I'm a native speaker in German and I'm also able to read the old German handwriting that that was really the perfect match in those days. And then I received it, and since then I was somehow on board. I wasn't involved in the law case, which lasted until 2016 in Israel, with the final decision of the Supreme Court. Supreme Court, yes, indeed, it went up to there. But from time to time, the lawyer of the National Library consulted me concerning questions of content and understanding of German handwritten materials and so on and so forth. But after the final decision of the Supreme Court in Israel ruling that the National Library indeed should receive all those materials, I immediately stepped in when we fetched all these different shares of the materials from bank vaults in Tel Aviv and a private apartment in Tel Aviv, which was really a mess. And eventually in 2019 from bank vaults in Zurich, Switzerland, where we found most of the Kafka materials that remained with Max Brod's papers. And so during all those years, I dived more and more deeply into the materia, and I read Kafka. I studied Kafka because I knew by then already that whenever you start to arrange a new collection, a new personal archive, you have to know, of course, the backgrounds of the creator's life, of the different works he or she wrote. And that was here in this case, it was a double match because I had to learn something about Max Brod and to learn also something about Kafka. And then I felt at a certain moment that I'm able to deal with those materials, and that was exactly when we got them. But while, of course, cataloging them and checking them, you always learn so much more. And yeah, so that was really a great experience and a great adventure. And it all accumulated in 2024 when we decided, alongside another group of institutions worldwide, to have a Kafka exhibition in Jerusalem. That was for the first time after 50 years in Israel that there was a Kafka exhibition. The last one was in 1969. And now we had this one honoring Kafka on its 100th death anniversary, as so many places did. And that was, of course, an additional occasion for me to learn more and to get more understanding of Kafka, and discussing it with friends, colleagues, experts, and later on with so many visitors that we had. And that was really another part of it. So since then, things have calmed down a bit, but I'm happy to share my experiences tonight with you again.
Thank you. How about Ross in Nyack, New York?
Yeah. So my long love affair with Kafka began around the age of 15, which I at one point might have thought was something unusual about me, that it was that age. But since I've been talking a lot more with other people, other readers of Kafka, it turns out I think that's kind of the average age a lot of people first encounter and fall in love with Kafka's writing. So I was in high school and made the first friendships of my life that were really based on a shared interest in literature. And those two friends introduced me to Kafka, and we became acquainted with Kafka by reading him aloud to each other in the school library during either, I guess, free periods we had or periods that we freed up in order to do so. And we would read, we were reading The Trial and The Judgment and the stories, or we were reading The Trial and The Castle and the stories in the old Muir translations in the Shokin editions that look like more like this. This is not any of those books, but it was these editions that were in our school library. And we would constantly burst out laughing reading these stories to each other, because when read aloud, the humor really comes alive in a way that sometimes one might miss. Also, if maybe one has the interference of the Kafka myth already, which we didn't have coming to it naively at that age. And, at some point later, I read, I think it was the John Updike introduction to the complete stories. in English, where he recounted the many times recounted anecdote from Max Brode's biography of Kafka about how when Kafka would read aloud from his works, he and his friends would all not be able to stop laughing. And it was presented as if it should be surprising. And that was sort of when I learned that it's supposed to be surprising. The comical aspects of Kafka are supposed to be surprising. I think many readers, again, didn't have secret access to something that many readers don't. I think it's more the Kafka myth that he was so grim and foreboding and nightmarish that would get in the way of that. But many readers, I think, when they come to Kafka, immediately experience those comic aspects, and readers of Kafka and critics have picked up on it from the very beginning. It's always presented again and again as if it's a secret about Kafka. And that was the beginning, and I'm not going to go through the rest of my life between then and when I translated. Eventually, the reason I'm here is I translated Kafka's diaries the first time in their complete, uncensored, unexpurgated form. So it's a rather large book. There was a German edition of the diaries that came out in 1990 that finally revealed to the public the entirety of the diaries in their original state. In the 40s, there had been an earlier edition that Max Brod had overseen that was heavily edited and interfered with, and not only presented in a much more tidy, orderly fashion than the notebooks were really in, but also he cut a lot of material that revealed sides of Kafka that at the time he found either in some way complicated, maybe what I've been calling the Kafka myth. So he kind of sanitized and sanctified Kafka through his editorial interventions in the diaries. And the restored edition that came out in German in 1990 it had never been translated into English by the time I came around to propose translating it in around 2014. It ended up taking me 8 years, and my translation finally came out in 2023, and that's Kafka's Diaries. I could talk a lot more about that, more about the specifics of the differences between the editions and so on. But yeah, I discovered that German edition while in Berlin about 20 years before my translation was published. So it was 2003, 2004. I was in the Dussmann bookstore on Friedrichstrasse, a giant, it's called a Kulturkaufhaus, like a cultural department store. It's an incredible place. It's 4 or 5 floors filled with books. There also used to be records and CDs. I'm not sure. There's definitely a stationery section. And anyway, I was there and looking at the Kafka complete works, or the paperback version of the complete works in German, thinking, oh, my German's finally good enough that I could read what I read when I was 15 and, in an ongoing way for those 10 years in the original. And when I looked at the diaries, they were I just knew, could immediately see, just even from the way it looked on the page, that there was so much that distinguished it from the version I'd read in English. And I was so captivated by it. And then, another 10 years went by and nobody had translated it. While meanwhile, the trial, the castle, people had Schoken, the same publisher that published my translation, had published new editions of those unfinished manuscripts based on the more faithful critical editions that had come out in the 80s and 90s. So that was I just jumped from origin story to end to like the mid origin story, so that I won't do anything in between.
All right. Thanks, Ross. And Steve, also upstate New York.
Yeah. First, thanks for inviting me, and I'm honored to be amongst this august company. Hard to know where to begin. My life has been, in some ways, defined, I think, by my reading of Kafka. He's been in the air that I breathe for many decades. Hard to remember my first encounter. I was young, like Ross, when I first began to read him. Stories fascinated me, of course. And I can't say that I especially understood them in the beginning. It didn't seem to matter. I read somewhere that Einstein said to Thomas Mann, what do they mean? I'm not sure you have to understand Kafka to appreciate him. Of course, there's a whole industry of interpretation, like a kind of Talmud to his Torah. But the more I began to read, the more I began to learn about the man too, and when I began to understand. Sorry, my cat. Uh, what an angst-ridden, alienated, self-loathing, frightened character he was in so many ways. I thought, hey, my kind of guy. And, uh, I love Ross's this sort of introduction of how the humor was the thing that communicated itself to him at first, and Kafka's playfulness is something that is often dismissed by people that don't really know the work. I come back often to the parable, the before the law parable. Where the doorkeeper shuts the door to the law, read, maybe a truth of one's essential self. It can, a multitude of interpretations for exactly what the law means in that parable. But I had a sense that, it's sort of a moment when Kafka is inventing the modern age in a way, shutting the door to our access to a kind of primal truth. And after Kafka, you get the generations of writers whose theme is alienation. You get a kind of a Kafkaesque landscape in, say, T.S. Eliot's Wasteland. Think of the leafless tree on the stage of Beckett's Waiting for Godot, where the characters are waiting for not the Messiah, but this character who never shows up. All this feels like a universe that Kafka invented in a way. And then I read Ernst Pavel's biography, Nightmare of Reason, and began to understand just how Kafka's situation as a Jew in Prague informed all of the work. As a Jew from Memphis, Tennessee, where we were maybe 1% of the population, although Jews owned pretty much everything in Memphis, but nevertheless, I identified with the man and began to appreciate the way that being a Jew who spoke German in Czechoslovakia of the time was, alienating him. To be a Jew in Middle Europe, fin de siècle, early 20th century, was to be a kind of exile. And, and to see the way that circumstance really does inform all of the work in a very fundamental way, and gave me another lens. I mean, you can look at Kafka through, a multitude of lenses, but the Jewish one appealed to me especially, and that's kind of the way I've been leaning on that particular lens for the last decade or two or three. So, yeah, love the guy.
Thanks, Steve. And can I follow up? See, I have a question for you, Steve, and also for Ross on this, and Stefan. I'll have one in a bit for you as well. Steve, I'm wondering also how that informed your writing, and your work, that sense that you identified with Kafka.
Yeah.
And then Ross, my question for you separate is, this idea of the humor, if you saw that through the diaries, and the same, if if you see that's who he is as well, as opposed to just on the structured page. But Steve.
Yeah, I confess to having been irreverent with Kafka's work. You know, there's a way in which he, in his writing, was embracing the myths, the legends of Scripture, of the Bible. In so many of the parables and stories, and the paradox is sort of at the heart of Kafka's method, and he gets at his truths through paradox. And so he can write about Abraham, he can write about Jacob wrestling the angel, he can write about Mount Sinai, what have you, and put his particular spin on it. And it fascinated me the way that Kafka, who is a sort of saint of hopelessness, and and all of the negative elements that we attribute to him, is really anchoring so much of his work in these bedrock myths, and in a way writing about biblical themes and often classical mythical themes, in the language of faith, in a way. And so there what in Jewish theology is midrash, a kind of commentary on Scripture, on Torah, on the law. Torah is sort of equivalent to the law, and there's an irreverence in what Kafka does. He'll spin these tales into a kind of paradox, where they cease to mean what they did. They cease to have the kind of authority that they once did. And we can talk about specifics maybe later, but in my own work, I often, occasionally, have gone to Kafka, and I wrote a parable of my own, After the Law, in which there's a character who sort of steals beneath the legs of the doorkeeper to steal the law, and leaps out the window of the palace of the law with the doorkeeper stuck in the window above him, and the man from the country chasing my sort of impish Eulenspiegel-like character. Another story in which there's and forgive me for talking about my own stuff, but you asked, and and it's a way in which Kafka has kind of infiltrated my poor soul. The the oh the old ghetto of Prague, which was a crowded, disease-ridden, impoverished place. It's all often used as a sort of background for mysterious tales like Gustav Meyrink's story of the Golem, and the place where Rabbi Loew in the 16th century created the Golem, this Jewish Frankensteinian monster to protect the Jews from pogrom. And so I had to write a story where the Golem was disanimated. What he was, he had the inscription MS, which means truth, on his forehead, and you cancel the aleph, and you're left with the word met. In Hebrew is death. The golem collapses, and they stick his remains in the attic of the Altneu Shul synagogue in Prague. I have a character who steals into the attic of a synagogue and finds not the golem, but Gregor Samsa, who has managed to survive and remain in the attic of the synagogue. And this is, um, uh, ways in which, Kafka has infiltrated my imagination, for better or worse. Sorry, I went on too long with that. Um,
Thanks. And then Ross, with the diaries, that notion of humor, because I think, as you said, it can be surprising to people to see the work
And
as humorous.
I think Steve touched on something about it, that the humor has to do with a certain playfulness with the way that he's portraying things as opposed to the what he's portraying. Although some of the scenes are slapstick too, but what's actually happening is often horrific. Like one of the very first things my friends and I were laughing at is the climax of the judgment when the father gets up on the bed, stands on the bed, to tower over and berate his son, and it's a shocking, horrific surprise where the father almost becomes a kind of monster from being this frail father, and yet the way he stands on the bed and is holding himself up by the ceiling is just physically funny too, and the way Kafka describes it with such a deadpan. So a lot of the humor is at the level of expression and dramatization, whereas the content often fits with the picture of Kafka as an incredibly dark, anxious, explorer of nightmare sides of human experience or modern experience. So in the diaries, you get a lot of similar things on the both because the diaries are also filled with drafts of fiction or filled with writing that hovers between the autobiographical and the fictional, or where you just can't decide what he's doing in a given text because he's writing what seems like about himself, and then it starts to transform and you realize, well, maybe this from the very beginning has been a literary piece in progress that never made it out of the diaries necessarily. But there's also a lot in the diaries that did make it out of the diaries where you might think, well, was that a diary entry? And he looked at it later and thought, oh, this makes a good piece of literary prose. I'm going to publish it in a Prague literary journal and then collect it in my first collection of stories. Or was every piece of writing in the diaries potentially a literary piece, whether it came from a personal moment or not? And a lot of that becomes very blurry in the diaries. So some of the pieces that are funny could double as a diary entry that's about his personal life and happens to be funny because he's writing it with that same flair, or a diary entry that has that same flair and humor. And you might look at it as just a diary entry, but you could also look at it as, well, this was just as much an attempt to give a literary dramatization to his everyday life that maybe just didn't make it for him into published work because there's so much he chose not to publish that he chose to destroy in his lifetime. So a good example to get concrete, that kind of exemplifies everything I just said, because he's writing about suffering. He's writing about a headache he has, right? But it's not like a diary entry where you would just say, had a headache today. Let me see. My flags are insane. But let me see if I can find the entry and just read it to you. If not, I could probably paraphrase it pretty well. I'm seeing other funny entries here. Well, the one about the headache, a standard diary entry would be like, had a terrible headache today. But he describes the headache as an inner leprosy. And he says, it reminds me of those skull cross sections that you might see in textbooks. And he says, where I can already feel the knife, the dissecting knife, like sliding and slipping along the membranes and slicing them ever thinner, very close to working brain parts, And so it's this little parable, or it reads like a little piece of Kafka's prose. It's also a really bad headache, so it's not necessarily funny to think of somebody suffering this much, but he's clearly given it this dramatic, hyperbolic, um, aesthetic quality. And the diaries are basically that's the kind of writing that's most prevalent in the diaries is this kind of self-dramatization. Um, I don't think Kafka distinguished sharply in his own mind between when he was writing literature and when he was writing a letter or a diary entry. I think he let those lines blur, and you see him in a letter to Max Brod tell a story about overhearing his mother have what sounds like a really mundane conversation with a neighbor who's just putting out a little snack in the yard, and then you find that same passage in the draft of a major novella that he was never able to finish at the beginning of his life, but which was published posthumously, called Description of a Struggle, in a whole expressionistic way. This same little anecdote appears in there, and then other pieces of that draft that he never published, he did publish as like a 3-line short prose that was part of this larger draft. So he was just constantly generating potential literature, and then sometimes plucking something out and deciding to take that step and publish it, which was for him always a very ambivalent step. And sometimes he wished he could take it back, or you find him in his diaries rewriting something that was published in 1914, I think, originally in the penal colony, or way before. He's rewriting it in 1917 in his diaries. He writes several alternative endings of it, or alternative passages that don't even make it necessarily all the way through to the end, because he's still thinking of his writing as this kind of constant flux. And that's what you encounter in the diaries. You encounter his writing as in its flux, as opposed to any of these pieces published in his lifetime where he kind of took them out of the messy process that you see in the diaries and decided this can stand alone as a piece with all the ambivalence that entailed for Kafka. Or Brod kind of, as Brod himself put it, like extorted it from him and prodded him to publish it. So the diaries kind of contain all of, to me at least, in my impression, they contain all of the riches of Kafka's writing that you find elsewhere. They include drafts of letters, so they even include riches that you find in the letters where he's writing to a specific recipient, because he happens to have those in the diaries. The judgment itself, just like as a case in point, was generated in the diaries. It was written in the diaries. And in my version, unlike in the earlier edition, you see that happen. The earlier edition had a footnote that said, like, here Kafka wrote the judgment in his diaries, which is one of, to me, the most scandalous aspects of that edition, because if there is a dramatic arc to the diaries, it's this writer trying to write something that feels unified and satisfies him, and failing and suffering and writing over and over again these drafts that disintegrate and break off. And then suddenly he writes this whole breakthrough piece, the judgment, in the diaries, that just like emerges in the middle of the diaries as this eruption, or he calls it, in the diaries themselves, he calls it like a birth. And then the next diary entry is him celebrating this moment of triumph in his own writing. He says, look, this is the way writing must be done, with this kind of cohesion and so on. And then you watch him kind of fall apart again and start writing these little fragments and aphorisms. And so, that's kind of a story that the diaries tell, and the judgment is the center of that story. And then the old edition just left it out. So here you can see composing it. It's almost verbatim what he later published, except you see, as he's getting swept up in the composition of it, he starts dropping quotation marks and line breaks, and you can kind of see the rhythm and pacing of the spontaneity of its emergence on the page. So
that's fascinating. Stefan, when you did the exhibit, how we're hearing a lot about Kafka sort of as a person and as a creator, what were the challenges, I guess, in showing that?
Actually, we had two major aims with our exhibition. The first one was, and it worked perfectly, because the exhibition space is divided into large halls. And so the first topic was actually the question, who is this man, Kafka? And we tried to split it up into 6 different topics of his life, of his being a young man, a character. And these topics were the family background, what was the family he was coming from, and what were the relationships rather complicated within the family. And then we had another track is about, of course, Kafka being a creator. And since unfortunately we do not have too many literary manuscripts, we just have the 3 attempts to write the very early novel Wedding Preparations on the Countryside that we could display. And but we do have a large number of his drawings. So for us, it was important to show both sides of his work, and drawings, of course, much less known and less estimated, I guess, until recently. And a third topic was very important for us in Israel, the relationship between Kafka and his Jewish background, and where did he meet that, and what did it make with him? Did he reflect on it and actively, passively, and certain interesting points where he had encounters with Judaism in a very direct way, or offered interpretations maybe. And then we had a section about Kafka and his friends, another section which was really close to it, Kafka and women, fascinating topic, and of course related to each other. And the last section in this first hall was about Kafka's death and sickness and death. And the aim was actually in this first hall to give some answers to our visitors who may have heard the name, may have heard the adjective, something is Kafkaesque, as our talk today, and but maybe do not really have a clue who this man was and what actually he did and why he had such a strong impact on world literature. And the second hall was more about how Kafka had an imprint on Israeli culture, and how he influenced on the public cultural debate in newspapers starting from the 1950s, mainly. First time, by the way, he was mentioned in an Israeli newspaper was in 1925, I believe it was, in Haaretz newspaper, when they were announcing the first German edition of the trial.
Mm-hmm.
And then even up to interpretations by artists, and what impact he had on movies, on theater, and so on and so forth. And we also invited 8 contemporary Israeli illustrators, comic illustrators, to react in their own way on Kafka's drawings. And they did it very, very differently and very nicely. And that was just in order to show how much he still is able, even 100 years after his death, to influence and to give some ideas. So the challenges were, of course, that we had so many questions and topics that we had to cover, and we didn't want to confuse our visitors more than Kafka would have done by himself in his writing. So the simple aim was maybe to offer some answers to so many questions that you come up with while thinking about Kafka or reading or trying to understand his writing. I don't know if we really managed, but people were mostly happy. And referring to what Ross just explained about his diaries, that really gave me a big fun, I would even say, while thinking what kind of model we could actually add to each of the 6 sections in the first hall about Kafka's life. I said, well, there must be something matching in his diaries about each and every one of these topics. And happily, there are these PDF online editions that you simply can search. And then I searched according to terms like family or Judaism or literature. And I always found something, and sometimes it was really hard to decide what quote we should use for what topic. But of course, there's this famous quote by him, what do I have in common with the Jews? I have hardly common anything with myself. And that was, of course, the motto for matching for the Jewish track. And then there's this other one, that you can both be surrounded by loving individuals in your family, and simultaneously can really be very, very lonely. and about literature, that anything which is not literature is just doing him harm, and he hates anything like that. And
Kinds of boring.
and people usually laughed, of course, bursted out in laugh when they came to the section of women where this quote was, a married friend is not a friend, and so on and so forth. And so that was really amazing to see that actually you can use his diaries also in that way. And yeah, so and another big challenge for us was, of course, that we had to present materials written in a language which is not really very common anymore in Israel. We have many of these two-dimensional, very flat materials that you would present in vitrines, and that could be all very boring. And for that reason, we really try to transform the whole story into something more vivid and more like an experience where you could walk through Kafka's life on 6 different tracks, and you could change in between. There are hidden doors in between, and so on and so forth. And that was really lovely to see that. The credit goes to a good friend. He became a good friend of mine in the meantime, an Israeli artist, Hadass Ofrat, who developed the idea, the concept for how to present all these materials. We added some videos, theater production based on Kafka's Hebrew notebooks made by Ruth Kanner Theater Group here in Israel, in Tel Aviv. And we had the Max Brod interview, which I just saw is also put into your online exhibition that you guys just created there, and so on and so forth. And so combining all that together, I think we made some good stuff there. With all that.
Thanks.
He asked, how lonely are you? Are you as lonely as Kafka Hauser? And he said, I'm as lonely as Franz Kafka. Can I just pick up on what the issue of humor in Kafka? Because his language is always kind of famously characterized as being just stripped to its essence. And, in many ways, he felt estranged from the German that he grew up speaking. He could speak Czech. And always there's a sense of exile with Kafka. But the language is so deadpan and so almost bureaucratic, legalese, and yet the situations, the subjects are absurd. And I think that's a recipe, a perfect recipe for comedy. You use the straight language to describe an absurd situation. Gregor awoke from troubled dreams to find himself turned into a bug. That's a very funny opening. The opening of Report to the Academy, where I'm, the ape is here to explain, what his life as a man has become. Even, the hunger artist, there's pain at the root of all of Kafka's stories, because he was in genuine pain most of his life for one thing or another. He said, I am literature. And, literature was his identity. It occupied the whole of the man to the point of excluding all the things that might have made him a man, such as inability, to sustain a relationship with women, and and just to feel like an ordinary person, rather than an artist, which had all kinds of ambiguous connotations for Kafka, most of them painful, but at the same time, there is this playfulness in these visions, and you can, I think that most readers are guilty, and I have been guilty myself, of extracting the pain, extracting the nightmarish vision. Kafka, I mean, it's a cliche now to talk about how Kafka's work anticipates the Holocaust. In a way, I think the world imitated Kafka in spades. But he, I think he had a lot of fun with the stories, and as Ross was talking about, and sort of famously, his friends laughed at at his readings aloud. The Gershom Scholem and Walter Benjamin, close friends, and two of the great minds of the 20th century who were Kafka fanatics before Kafka's work was ever really disseminated. And Benjamin used to talk about how if someone could extract the comedy, the essential comedy from Jewish theology, the work would in some ways be redemptive, and Kafka was his example of that. With Sholem, his example was more in the realm of mysticism, but he was a cute and funny guy. As opposed to this avatar of the nightmare of our times.
Thanks. And it kind of part of what you're saying, Steve, and all of you sort of started to touch on this idea of Kafkaesque, which I feel obliged to discuss since we titled the talk. It seems like when we hear that term, I mean, it seems like it's often referring to the trial in terms of the context, and certainly it comes up in casual conversation. I feel like weekly, I hear somebody refer to something as being Kafkaesque, whether it's something at the grocery store or that mundane, or something going on in the larger political realm, but we see it in federal court rulings. We see it in Supreme Court rulings as this sort of shorthand. And I'm wondering, and I one of the students, Abby, had sort of asked this question of, does the term becoming more mainstream and broad in its use maybe have a negative effect on Kafka's work? In terms of how we read Kafka, it's become a shorthand for what it means to experience Kafka. If everybody's calling everything annoying Kafkaesque, does that harm the? Does that have an effect on the legacy of his work?
Well, it does until you read him.
Yeah, I think once anybody if it generates enough curiosity for somebody to read Kafka and then discover, I guess I did recently speak to somebody who had never read Kafka and had different expectations because of the Kafkaesque. Like they thought it was going to be a really straightforward kind of social political satire, and were therefore, this is the trial that this person read, and was therefore kind of just baffled that the trial is what it is. Now that could be he didn't have a positive response to that. I could see that also going in a really positive direction where you discover, like for me, there's so much more to the trial than the fact that kind of on the surface it captures our modern experience of, endless bureaucratic delay or whatever, or faceless, inaccessible, and arbitrary authority or irrational authority. It has all those aspects, but there's so much more going on. Speaking of humor, in the very first scene, the character who's arrested out of nowhere and doesn't know what he's being arrested for, he's looking for some form of ID, hoping that that will clear things up. And he tries to give these two guards who have arrived his bicycle license, hoping maybe that would, you know, because he can't find his papers. But yeah, I think it generated, in terms of how it reflects back on Kafka, because really what the Kafkaesque is showing how much of our world Kafka was already tuned into and either discovered or invented, right? Such that so many things seem to echo his work, or seem almost that they were anticipated by him. That's really less a commentary on Kafka's work itself as a commentary on our world, right? That like Kafka already lived in a paradigmatically modern, urban, bureaucratic world. You know, he didn't need to see the future to diagnose that. But to create what he created, it's so much thicker than the sense of the Kafkaesque. On the other hand, sometimes things are really, truly are Kafkaesque in a way that I've had to acknowledge, because I've spent a lot of time, I don't know, maybe sort of trying to combat the term, because that seems like the knowing thing to do if you really know Kafka well, is to sort of say, well, the Kafkaesque doesn't capture Kafka, which is true, it doesn't. But that sense of disorientation, and sometimes it's really just hit you over the head. Like there's a thing of being, you know, at the DMV or at a call center or something where the delays are just absurd and it's catch-22s. And many authors have done that sort of satire. Some of them, you know, mostly after Kafka, and he's definitely one of the, originators or something, where you experience and you say, oh, that's Kafkaesque, and that seems a little trivializing. But then I heard this story of this Arab American translator at Guantanamo who worked for the U.S. Army and was accused of, because of his translations, of somehow collaborating or doing something wrong. You know, it wasn't clear what he had done wrong, but he was brutalized and interrogated. And eventually the government had to admit that he wasn't really doing anything wrong. But to save face, you know, they had to come to a plea deal where they dismissed him on the flimsiest of charges. And already this story sort of fits the template of the Kafkaesque. But then afterward, and I was looking at this on like This American Life, or I think it was the Serial podcast, did a series on Guantanamo, and it was a couple episodes about this. But in the aftermath of it, they had he had these two interrogators, and that's like truly out of Kafka. He always has these two characters, you know, that he actually, in his diaries, you discover they're based on two characters he witnessed in a Yiddish play that were called the Two Captives. He describes the function of these characters in the Yiddish play, and you're like, that's exactly the function of the guards in the trial or the assistants in the castle. There's two of them. Sometimes one is tall and thin, the other short and fat. Sometimes they seem to be identical, or they seem to be shifting or trading personalities, or in the castle, the main character just gives them names, and then he's going to call them by the same name. They have names, but he's just going to call them both the same name because he can't figure out which is which. But this guy in real life, he has two interrogators, and two are supposed to debrief him, and you find out this is all nonfiction, right? That you would think their role now is to try to figure out like what went wrong, how did the government mess up, but actually their role seems to still be to like dig up something that this guy did wrong, and they end up like kind of living with him and entering his life, and they interview him and they say, oh yeah, we loved him, we wanted to take care of him, we were worried about him because he seemed almost on the brink, you know, so we were trying to support him. It's like, no, they were his interrogators. But then they accompanied him on his honeymoon, and his wife would have to cook dinner for them, and they interview the wife, and she's like, yeah, I didn't really want these two interrogators with us on our honeymoon, but they were there, so I cooked for them. And like, this is truly out of Kafka. It's not just like bureaucratic deferral, but it's like plagiarism, you know. And yet this is something that happens every day. Things like
and
this.
It's so interesting too that, you know, we look at these kinds of instances through the lens of Kafka's writing, and I mean, Proustian, Joycean, these are descriptions of his style, but when you say Kafkaesque, you're really talking about the atmosphere and the world that we experience.
Yeah, it's being in the world in some ways, and so yeah, I think it could certainly reduce and trivialize and become a cliche that um, flattens the work or even distracts people so much that they don't even go back to the work, and that would be unfortunate. But I still think that there's something about Kafka that does continue to, and why he's never gotten out of date, is because there's something that just does continue to describe the world that we live in.
Well, the
And
world is caught up with him,
yeah,
and
yeah,
in terms of irrational brutality, Kafka sort of, made the laid the template, and and we've worked with that, and we've expanded on that in hideous ways.
Stefan, did you see that in the exhibition with people who attended, that they were seeing something that was speaking also to the contemporary world they live in?
Mostly in the second hall that I mentioned before, we had these 4 video screens where we simultaneously had the short story Before the Law in 4 languages. So each screen was dedicated to a language. We had the original German, we had the Hebrew, Arabic, and English. And for each language, we had 2 speakers, and all of them were colleagues from the National Library, because we said our idea is that Before the Law is maybe, in my eyes, in our eyes, the most dense Kafkaesque story that you can imagine, and that gives you an idea what Kafkaesque means somehow. And people were sitting in front of these 4 screens, and always when I gave a tour, I let them sit there and listen for 5 minutes or so, and they immediately understood what it is. And when I maybe was forced to help them a bit in order to understand about bureaucracy and the total misunderstandings that you can find there, and the misconcepts and affairs that do not lead to any clear place, and so on and so forth. And they all were like, oh yes, of course, yeah, we all had this experience, and then I said, well, this is maybe the reason why he is still so successful, down from southern Argentina to through Europe and the Arabic world, and even to the Far East. And also, in order to depict that, at the last section of our exhibition was a big bookshelf with contemporary works by Kafka in 6 different languages, and we invited to our visitors just maybe to sit down for a while and to have a look on short stories, diaries. Rossi's translation was also there, and letters, and people indeed did that. So that was amazing to see that. Seeing that and thinking about Kafkaesque and about his life and his way in order to see, or his way to see the world, that made something with them.
Can I just read a brief? Walter Benjamin, I think he wrote this on the eve of his suicide. He was fleeing the Nazis over the Pyrenees, and was not allowed to cross over into Spain, and ended up killing himself. But he said Kafka's world, frequently of such playfulness and interlaced with angels. And it struck me too, because Benjamin talks about angels in Kafka, and you have all these messengers, who never arrive. And in Hebrew, angel and messenger are synonymous. Interlaced with angels is the exact complement of his era, which is preparing to do away with the inhabitants of this planet on a considerable scale. The experience which corresponds to Kafka, the private individual, will probably not become accessible to the masses until such time as they are being done away with. which sort of gives me goose flesh. He wasn't a prophet. He was a man of genius who examined himself and his various phobias and anxieties, and projected a world.
It's great. Thank you, Steve. This maybe we'll stop there. That seems like a good place to stop, and it is 11 o'clock for Stefan at night. So it went. I only got to two of my questions. I have a whole. We can do the sequel
can hang
next
around
time.
after this. There's so much to talk about.
I know. But I want to thank all of you for the three of you for participating and playing with us here, and for all the help that you gave.
Can I tell a brief anecdote?
Yeah.
My ex-wife was an authentic Arkansas hillbilly, and her brother died under mysterious circumstances, and that's another story. But for the wake, for the funeral, the family came down out of the Ozark Mountains of Arkansas with their banjos, and what have you. The gathering, I mean, first they didn't know what to do with me because I'm a Jew and a writer, two things that were pretty alien to them. And I was talking to the wife of one of my ex-wife's uncles, and she said, we had a Jew writer in the family back in the old country. And I said, really? And she said, yeah, and he's supposed to be famous. And I said, well, where was this? And she said, well, it was back in Czechoslovakia. And, and I said, well, do you remember his name? And she said, no, but my family's name back then was Lowy, which of course was Kafka's mother's family. And my jaw dropped to the floor, just imagining this sort of the channeling of the blood from Kafka to this woman in the Ozarks. It fascinated me.
So it is ubiquitous, huh, Steve?
Yeah. And that it was me that she was telling this to. And
so he was a prophet, Steve.
Well, the perfect receptacle, yes, for this information.
All right. Well, again, thanks you all. I again thank Robert Blaze and his family for supporting all of this, and to be continued. And Ross, I know Heidi mentioned too that you're currently working on the letters, so we'll
right.
see those next.
Yeah. Visit Franz on Substack. It's a franzjournal.substack.com, where I translate the next chronological letter every 2 weeks. And then in between, we have contributions and essays. The latest contribution is by Elif Bataman about, and it tells some of the story of the prehistory of the exhibit, not the exhibit, but the archive in the National Library. Because she went to Tel Aviv to interview some of the parties to that trial. And it also tells the story of Kafka and Max Brod. It's called Kafka and Brod. It's up on Franz right now.
Great. And Stefan, if my memory is at the library, the National Library has a lot of the archives online too, that people can.
Yes, everything is online, and we are proud still to be the only institution who did that step.
That's great. And of course, you have Steve's works to refer to, as well as a terrific essay on Kafka in Salmagundi magazine, which I think you can find online, that particular article. So you can further explore everything we've heard today. So
it's a pleasure being with you guys.
Thank you. Pleasure.
Yeah, thank everybody for attending and listening too. Bye-bye.
Goodbye.